In the polished dining room of Harvest and Rye, where crystal glasses catch the afternoon light and Southern comfort food meets fine dining, a single word shatters the carefully crafted atmosphere. Leave. But what happens next will challenge everything: a chef's legacy, a grandmother's wisdom, and the unspoken rules that still divide us when we sit down to break bread. The lunch rush at Harvest and Rye was just beginning to wind down when Maya Chen, the restaurant's assistant manager, heard raised voices from the bar area. She looked up from the inventory sheet spread across her desk in the back office, tilting her head to listen. After 15 years in the restaurant business, she could differentiate between the usual dining room chatter and the distinct tone of trouble brewing. "I've already told you, sir. I'm going to have to ask you to leave." Maya recognized the voice immediately. Jessica Palmer, one of their newer servers, hired just 3 months ago. There was something in Jessica's tone that made Maya's skin prickle, a barely concealed edge that didn't match the upscale restaurant's carefully cultivated atmosphere. "I have every right to be here," a male voice responded, the words clear and measured despite obvious tension. "I'm a paying customer, and I have a reservation." Maya was already moving before she heard Jessica's reply, her low heels clicking against the polished hardwood floors. As she rounded the corner into the main dining room, the scene unfolded before her like a staged photograph. Near the host station stood a black man in his mid-30s, wearing a charcoal gray suit that Maya's fashionable wife would have immediately identified as Tom Ford. His leather briefcase and steel watch spoke of corporate success, but his posture spoke of something else, a familiar tension, a practiced restraint. Facing him was Jessica, her blonde hair pulled back in a perfect ponytail, her crisp white shirt bearing the restaurant's logo. Her hand was extended toward the door in an unmistakable gesture of dismissal. Other diners had begun to notice, conversations dropping to whispers. Maya saw phones being quietly raised, their cameras capturing what everyone in the room seemed to recognize was about to become an incident. "Is there a problem here?" Maya asked, keeping her voice neutral as she approached. Jessica turned, relief washing over her face. "Yes, I was just explaining to this gentleman that we're fully booked for lunch." The man's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I have a reservation for 1 o'clock, under the name Robinson. Marcus Robinson." Maya knew immediately he was telling the truth. She had seen his name in the reservation book that morning. Marcus Robinson, party of 1 p.m. She had noted it specifically because it was a first-time guest, and Harvest and Rye prided itself on making memorable first impressions. "I've already checked," Jessica insisted, her voice taking on a slight tremor. "There must be some mistake. Besides, we have certain standards here." "Jessica," Maya's voice cut through the air like a blade. "A word, please." But before they could step away, the main doors of the restaurant swung open. James Harrison, the owner and executive chef of Harvest and Rye, stood framed in the doorway, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the hardwood floors. His dark eyes took in the scene with the same careful attention he used to inspect plates before they left his kitchen. James had built Harvest and Rye from nothing, transforming an abandoned warehouse into one of the city's most acclaimed restaurants. He was known for his innovative take on Southern comfort food, his commitment to local ingredients, and his absolute intolerance for anything that disrupted his guests' experience. What no one in the dining room knew, what even Maya didn't know, was that James had already been watching the situation unfold through the security cameras in his upstairs office. He had seen Jessica turn Marcus away from 2 different empty tables before the confrontation began. He had watched her whisper to other servers, seen her deliberately ignore Marcus's attempts to explain his reservation. But James Harrison was not a man who rushed to judgment. He had learned patience in the kitchen, where rushing led to burned sauces and ruined dishes. He had learned to watch, to observe, to understand the full story before taking action. "Maya," he said quietly, his deep voice carrying across the now silent dining room, "please show Mr. Robinson to his table, the one by the window. Jessica, my office. Now." The next few moments would set in motion a chain of events that would challenge everything Jessica thought she knew about consequences, everything Marcus had learned about justice, and everything James had built over the past 20 years. But none of them knew that yet. None of them could see how this lunch service would change not just their lives, but the very fabric of their community. Maya led Marcus to the window table, acutely aware of the dozens of eyes following their movement across the dining room. As she pulled out his chair, she noticed his hands, steady but gripping his briefcase just a little too tightly. She'd seen that control before, in her father's face when he was told his accent was too thick to manage his own restaurant, in her wife's shoulders when they were asked if they were just friends at parent-teacher conferences. "I apologize for the confusion, Mr. Robinson," she said, placing the menu before him. "Can I start you with still or sparkling water?" "Still, please." His voice was composed, professional. Too composed, Maya thought. The voice of someone who'd had too much practice at staying calm in these situations. Meanwhile, Jessica followed James up the narrow stairs to his office, her heart pounding. The office was James's sanctuary, filled with cookbooks, vintage wine bottles, and framed reviews from prestigious food critics. But today it felt more like a principal's office, with James settling behind his desk, his expression unreadable. "Sit," he said simply. Jessica perched on the edge of the chair, her fingers fidgeting with her apron. "Mr. Harrison, I can explain. I was just trying to maintain the restaurant's standards. You always say that Harvest and Rye is about creating an elevated dining experience." "Stop." James held up a hand. He reached for his laptop, turned it around to face her. On the screen was security footage from the past 30 minutes. "Let's watch this together, shall we? And you can explain to me exactly which standards you were maintaining." The footage played in silence. Marcus entering the restaurant, Jessica's immediate change in posture, the whispered conversations with other servers, the 2 empty tables she'd claimed were reserved. I thought..." Jessica's voice faltered. "No," James said quietly. "You didn't think. You reacted. To what exactly?" Before Jessica could answer, there was a knock at the office door. It was Carlos, one of the line cooks who'd been with James since the beginning. His face was unusually serious. "Jefe, you need to see this." He held up his phone. On the screen was a social media post, already gathering shares and comments. Someone had filmed the entire confrontation and posted it with the hashtag #DiningWhileBlack. The comments were flowing in, many tagging the restaurant's accounts. James closed his eyes for a moment, remembering another restaurant, another time. He'd been 19, working his first kitchen job. The owner, an old-school chef from Louisiana, had taken him aside one day after James questioned why certain customers were always seated by the kitchen door. "Son," the chef had said, "there's 2 ways to run a restaurant. You can serve food, or you can serve justice. Choose carefully." James had chosen both, though it hadn't always been easy. Back in the dining room, Marcus was reviewing work documents on his laptop while waiting for his meal. He was a corporate lawyer, specialized in employment discrimination cases. The irony wasn't lost on him. His phone buzzed with a text from his sister. "You okay? You're trending." At the next table, an elderly white couple was speaking in staged whispers. "Well, I never," the woman said, glaring at Marcus. "This used to be such a nice place." Her husband grunted in agreement, making a show of moving his wallet from his back pocket to the front. Maya, overseeing service from her station near the bar, felt her face flush with anger, but before she could intervene, something unexpected happened. At another nearby table, a young white woman in business attire stood up. "Excuse me," she said loudly, addressing the elderly couple. "I'm a regular here, and you're right, it is a nice place, which is why that kind of racist commentary isn't welcome." The dining room fell silent again. The elderly couple sputtered in protest. And up in his office, James Harrison watched it all unfold on his security feed, knowing that his next actions would define not just his restaurant's future, but his own legacy. James turned to Jessica, his expression grave. "Do you know why I named this restaurant Harvest and Rye?" Jessica shook her head, thrown by the seemingly off-topic question. "My grandmother was a sharecropper in Georgia, worked the rye fields for white landowners her whole life. Never got to eat in the front of any restaurant, no matter how much money she had." He touched a worn cookbook on his desk, its pages yellow with age. "She taught me to cook using scraps from the landowners' kitchens. Said that good food doesn't know color, doesn't care about wealth, it just brings people together." The social media notifications continued to ping on Carlos's phone. Local news stations were beginning to pick up the story. That's Harvest and Rye was trending locally. Downstairs, the confrontation sparked by the young businesswoman's stand against the elderly couple had created a ripple effect through the dining room. Other customers were beginning to speak up, taking sides. The atmosphere had grown thick with tension. Marcus continued working on his laptop, his face a mask of practiced indifference. But Maya, bringing his water, noticed he'd typed the same sentence 3 times. "Mr. Robinson," she said quietly, "I want you to know—" "Don't," he interrupted gently. "Please, I just want to have my lunch and get back to work. I don't want to be a hashtag or a teaching moment." But it was too late for that. Through the restaurant's windows, they could see news vans beginning to gather. The story was spreading faster than anyone could control. In James's office, Jessica's composure finally cracked. I wasn't trying to." She paused, gathering herself. "My parents own a small diner in rural Pennsylvania. Last year they had to close it down because the neighborhood changed. That's what they always said. The neighborhood changed. They lost everything. I guess I brought their fears with me." James listened silently, remembering his own journey. He thought about the banks that denied him loans, the suppliers who demanded payment up front, the customers who asked to speak to the real owner when they saw a black man in chef's whites. Carlos's phone buzzed again. "Jefe, they're calling the corporate investors. They want a statement." The restaurant group that had helped finance Harvest and Rye's expansion was notoriously image-conscious. James had fought to maintain control of his kitchen, his menu, his vision, but he knew they held significant power over the restaurant's future. Meanwhile, Maya was dealing with another crisis. The elderly couple had demanded to speak to the owner, refusing to pay their bill after what they called reverse racism from other customers. The young businesswoman who'd spoken up was now on her phone, live streaming the situation to her considerable social media following. And Marcus had finally stopped pretending to work. He sat back in his chair, watching the scene unfold with the trained eye of a discrimination lawyer. He'd seen this pattern before: the initial incident, the public outrage, the corporate panic, the carefully worded apologies. But something felt different this time. Just then, the restaurant's doors opened again. A small group of protesters had already gathered, their hastily made signs declaring "Black Dollars Matter" and "Eat Elsewhere." But it wasn't a protester who entered. It was an elderly black woman, probably in her 80s, leaning on a worn wooden cane. She moved slowly but purposefully through the dining room, her eyes fixed on James's office stairs. The protesters fell silent. The dining room hushed. Maya recognized her immediately from the photo in James's office, his grandmother, Sarah Harrison, the woman who'd taught him to cook, who'd never been allowed to eat in a fine restaurant during the prime of her life. She hadn't been to the restaurant since opening night, saying it was too fancy for her tastes. But here she was, making her way through the chaos her grandson's establishment had become, carrying what looked like an old, battered cookbook under her arm. As she reached the bottom of the stairs, she turned to survey the dining room. Her eyes met Marcus's, held them for a long moment. Then she looked at the elderly couple, still refusing to pay their bill, at the young businesswoman with her phone, at Maya trying to hold everything together. Finally, she looked up toward James's office, where her grandson was about to make decisions that would affect far more than just one restaurant's future. Sarah Harrison slowly made her way up the stairs, each step deliberate, refusing help from those who offered. The worn cookbook under her arm was held like a shield, or perhaps a weapon. The restaurant remained eerily quiet, as if the very air was holding its breath. In his office, James heard the familiar tap of his grandmother's cane. He stood immediately, memories flooding back of countless Sunday mornings in her tiny kitchen, learning the secrets of perfect cornbread, and the even more valuable lessons about dignity in the face of injustice. Jessica also rose, recognition dawning on her face as she connected the photo on James's desk to the woman now entering the office. Sarah Harrison didn't acknowledge her. Instead, she moved to her grandson's desk and placed the cookbook down with careful precision. "You remember this book, James?" Her voice was soft but carried the weight of decades. "The one where I kept all my recipes?" James nodded, his throat tight. The book had been his grandmother's prized possession, filled not just with recipes, but with the margins of her life, notes about which white families would pay fairly for catering, which stores would serve black customers through the back door, which restaurants had the kindest kitchen staff who would share their scraps. "Open it," she commanded. James did, and something fell out. A yellowed newspaper clipping from 1963. It showed a young Sarah Harrison being turned away from a restaurant, her dignity intact despite the hatred visible on the faces around her. "That was my first time trying to eat at Carlton's," she said, naming what had once been the city's most prestigious restaurant. "I'd saved for months from my catering work, wore my finest dress. They said they were full, had empty tables just like today." She turned to Jessica, who seemed to shrink under her gaze. "Girl, how old are you?" 24, Jessica whispered. 24, Sarah repeated. "Same age I was in that picture. You think anything's changed?" Before Jessica could answer, Carlos knocked again. "The news crews are asking for comments, and Mr. Robinson's food is ready to go out." Sarah picked up her cookbook. "James, you remember what I taught you about serving food?" "That it's not just about feeding bodies," he replied automatically, the lesson ingrained from childhood. "It's about feeding souls." "And what feeds the soul, child?" "Dignity," James said softly. "Respect." Downstairs, the situation had continued to evolve. The young businesswoman's live stream had gone viral, capturing not just the initial incident, but the arrival of Sarah Harrison. Comments were flooding in from across the country, sharing similar stories, demanding action. Marcus had finally closed his laptop, watching the scene with a complex mix of emotions. As a discrimination lawyer, he'd seen countless cases of racism in public accommodations. But as a human being, he was tired of being a test case, tired of having to represent something larger than himself, tired of not being able to simply exist in spaces without becoming a statement. The elderly couple had begun gathering their things, muttering about calling their lawyer. The protesters outside had grown in number, their chants now audible through the restaurant's windows. "No justice, no peace." Maya approached Marcus's table, placing his order before him. A perfectly seared piece of salmon on a bed of Southern-style succotash. "Chef Harrison insists this is on the house," she began. "No," Marcus said firmly. "I'll pay full price. I won't let them turn this into charity." Up in the office, Sarah Harrison was still speaking, but now her words carried through the open door, drifting down to the dining room below. She spoke of dreams deferred, of dignity denied, of the long arc of justice that seemed to bend so slowly. "You built this place," she told James, "to be different, to be better. So now you got a choice to make, not just about one server or one customer, about what kind of place this is going to be, about what kind of person you're going to be." She turned to Jessica again. "And you, child, you got a choice too. We all carry our parents' fears, their hopes, their history. But at some point, we got to choose which parts to keep and which parts to leave behind." The cookbook lay open on James's desk, its pages full of not just recipes, but stories. Yes, of resistance, of persistence, of change that came slowly, but came nonetheless. And as Sarah Harrison stood there, bridging past and present, the path forward began to take shape in James's mind. James stood, straightening his chef's coat. "Grandma, will you come with me?" Sarah Harrison nodded, as if she'd been expecting this. Jessica remained frozen in her chair as they left the office, the cookbook left open on the desk, like evidence in a trial. In the dining room, conversations hushed as James and his grandmother descended the stairs. Maya watched them approach, understanding instinctively that something momentous was about to happen. The protesters outside pressed against the windows, phones recording every moment. James stopped in the center of the dining room, his grandmother a steady presence beside him. He looked at Marcus first, then at the elderly couple preparing to leave, then at each face in the room. "When I opened Harvest and Rye," he began, his voice carrying the same authority it held in the kitchen, "I made a promise to myself. This place would be about more than just food. It would be about legacy." He glanced at his grandmother. "About making things right." The elderly woman from the complaining couple sniffed loudly. "Well, I never expected to be attacked for being white in a restaurant." "No," Sarah Harrison spoke up, her voice gentle but firm. "I expect you never did, just like I never expected to be attacked for being black. Funny how that works, isn't it?" Marcus set down his fork, the salmon barely touched. As a lawyer, he'd seen countless companies try to handle situations like this, usually with carefully worded statements crafted by PR teams, mandatory sensitivity training, and quick settlements to make the problem go away. But something different was happening here. James moved to Marcus's table. "Mr. Robinson, I want to apologize, not just for today, but for every time you've had to sit quietly through moments like this. For every time you've had to be the bigger person. For every time you've had to represent more than just yourself." He turned to address the entire room. "Starting today, Harvest and Rye is implementing new policies." He gestured to Maya, who was already taking notes. "First, we're creating a community advisory board to review our service practices and training. Second, we're establishing a scholarship program for minority students interested in culinary arts and restaurant management." The young businesswoman had stopped live streaming, her phone lowered as she listened. Outside, the protesters had grown quiet, straining to hear through the windows. "Third," James continued, "we're going to start hosting monthly dinners where people from all parts of our community can come together, share a meal, and have the conversations we need to have. My grandmother will help plan the menus." He smiled slightly, "using recipes from this cookbook that fed hope when little else did." Jessica had appeared at the bottom of the stairs, her face tear-stained but composed. Sarah Harrison turned to her, holding out the cookbook. "Come here, child. Let me show you something." As Jessica approached tentatively, Sarah opened the book to a page filled with her spidery handwriting. "See this recipe? It's for reconciliation bread. Know why I called it that?" Jessica shook her head. "Because bread takes time. You can't rush it. You have to let it rise, let it become what it needs to become. And sometimes, when it doesn't rise right the first time, you don't throw it out. You start again. You learn." The elderly couple had stopped their exit, watching this exchange. The woman's hand had moved from her purse to her husband's arm, gripping it tightly as some emotion played across her face. Marcus closed his laptop completely, finally allowing himself to be fully present in this moment. As a discrimination lawyer, he'd seen countless attempts at corporate damage control. But as he watched Sarah Harrison begin to teach Jessica how to read her handwritten recipes, watched James move through his restaurant with renewed purpose, watched Maya begin drafting new policies on her tablet, he realized he was witnessing something rarer, the slow, difficult birth of real change. But the day wasn't over yet. Outside, news vans were still arriving. Social media was still buzzing. And in the kitchen, tickets were piling up as the dinner service approached. The real test of James's words, of Sarah's wisdom, of the restaurant's transformation, was just beginning. The first test came almost immediately. As Sarah Harrison continued showing Jessica her cookbook, the elderly couple finally made their decision. The woman approached James, her chin high, but her hands trembling slightly. "Mr. Harrison," she began, her voice carrying the weight of decades of privilege confronting itself. "I've been coming to fine restaurants in this city for 50 years. Never once did I think about—" She paused, struggling with words that challenged a lifetime of assumptions. "Your grandmother's cookbook. Might I see it?" Before James could respond, Sarah Harrison looked up. "Pull up a chair, Mrs. Eleanor Whitman. My husband is Richard." "Pull up a chair, Mrs. Whitman. Let me show you what a black woman had to do to feed her family with dignity in your fine restaurant's kitchens." The moment was interrupted by Carlos emerging from the kitchen, looking concerned. "Jefe, the dinner prep—" James checked his watch. Despite everything that had happened, despite the cameras outside and the social media storm brewing, they still had a restaurant to run. The evening's reservations were full, and he had built his reputation on never compromising the food, no matter what. "Maya," he called, "get the staff together in the kitchen, everyone, including front of house." As the employees gathered, Marcus Robinson quietly stood, reaching for his wallet. But James stopped him. "Mr. Robinson, I meant what I said about changes starting today. Would you consider staying? Being part of our first community dinner? It wasn't planned for tonight, but sometimes the best meals come from improvising." Marcus hesitated. He had cases to review, briefs to file. But he also recognized that sometimes justice wore unexpected faces. Sometimes it looked like an elderly black woman sharing her cookbook with the very people who would have turned her away half a century ago. "I'll stay," he said, "but I'm paying for my meal, all of it." In the kitchen, James addressed his assembled staff. The line cooks, servers, dishwashers, and hosts gathered around the prep tables, a diverse group that reflected the city itself. Jessica stood slightly apart, but Maya gently pulled her into the circle. "Today," James began, "we were reminded that a restaurant is more than its food. It's a space where life happens, where people come together, where moments become memories. Some of those moments shame us, some change us, and some—" He looked at his grandmother, still deep in conversation with Mrs. Whitman. "Some redeem us." He turned to Jessica. "You made a mistake today, a serious one. In many restaurants, that would be the end of the story. You'd be fired, we'd issue a press release, and nothing would really change." He paused. "But my grandmother taught me that every recipe has room for correction. If you're willing to learn, really learn, I want you to be part of what we're building here." Jessica wiped her eyes, nodding silently. "For tonight's service," James continued, "we're doing something different. Every table will get a card with their meal. On it will be a recipe from my grandmother's cookbook, along with its story. Maya, can you make that happen?" Maya was already typing on her tablet. "On it, chef." "Carlos, we need to prep for a full house. I have a feeling we're about to get very busy, and I want every plate that leaves this kitchen to tell our story." The kitchen burst into action, but with a different energy than usual. As servers began setting up for dinner service, Sarah Harrison remained at her table with Mrs. Whitman, the cookbook between them. They had been joined by the young businesswoman who had spoken up earlier, her phone now forgotten, as she listened to stories of resistance and resilience served with a side of cornbread. Marcus watched it all from his table, making notes not for a legal brief, but for something else. Perhaps, he thought, some stories needed to be told not in courtrooms, but in places where people broke bread together. Outside, the protesters had begun to disperse, but not before several of them made dinner reservations. The news vans remained, their reporters now shifting their stories from scandal to transformation. And on social media, Lefashbi's Harvest and Buy had evolved into Harvest and Build, with people sharing their own stories of restaurants, racism, and redemption. But the evening was just beginning, and with it, the real work of change. As the dinner service began, Harvest and Rye hummed with an energy unlike anything in its 5-year history. The dining room filled quickly, not just with regular customers, but with people who had seen the social media storm and decided to be part of something meaningful. Maya had worked miracles with the recipe cards, printing them on cream-colored cardstock, with Sarah Harrison's handwritten notes carefully reproduced. Each card told a story. The cornbread recipe that had funded Sarah's catering business, the secret spice blend she'd taught other black cooks working in white-owned restaurants, the preservation techniques that had helped sustain her community through hard times. Jessica, instead of being sent home, was given a new role for the evening. Under Sarah Harrison's watchful eye, she moved from table to table, learning to listen, really listen to people's stories. The elderly black couple celebrating their 50th anniversary, who had never been allowed to dine in fine restaurants during their youth. The mixed-race family teaching their children about both their Korean and African-American heritage through food. The young white couple who admitted they'd never thought about the history behind the Southern cuisine they enjoyed. In the kitchen, James channeled everything he was feeling into his cooking. Each plate became a canvas for storytelling, the carefully preserved family recipes elevated through his classical training, the fusion of traditions that spoke to both heritage and evolution. Carlos and the other kitchen staff moved with purpose, understanding that tonight, they weren't just cooking dinner, they were participating in something transformative. Marcus Robinson had moved to the bar, his laptop now truly closed, engaging in conversation with other patrons. As a discrimination lawyer, he'd seen countless corporate responses to racism, but this was different. This wasn't about damage control or legal compliance. This was about acknowledgement, education, and genuine change. "You know," he said to Maya as she passed by, "I could help with structuring that scholarship program, make sure it has real impact." Eleanor Whitman and her husband remained at their table, their bill long forgotten. Mrs. Whitman had begun sharing her own stories, of growing up in privilege, of unquestioned assumptions, of slow awakenings to reality. Sarah Harrison listened with the same attention she gave to monitoring a slow-cooking stew, understanding that some transformations couldn't be rushed. As the evening progressed, something remarkable began to happen. The barriers between tables began to dissolve. Conversations flowed between strangers. People shared recipes and memories, acknowledged uncomfortable truths, and began to see each other as more than just fellow diners. A local food critic, who had come in response to the social media buzz, sat in the corner taking notes. But instead of focusing on the food, which was exceptional, she found herself documenting something else. The way a restaurant could become a space for social change, one table at a time. Around 8 o'clock, James emerged from the kitchen to find his grandmother teaching Jessica how to properly knead dough in the prep area. The young server's hands were covered in flour, but her face showed a determination that went beyond learning a recipe. Bread is like people, Sarah was saying. Sometimes it needs a firm hand, sometimes a gentle touch, but mostly it needs patience and understanding. The news vans outside had begun to leave, but they had been replaced by something more significant. Ordinary people, drawn by the evolving story, making reservations for future dinners, asking how they could support the scholarship program, wanting to be part of whatever was happening inside these walls. Maya approached James with her tablet. "Chef, we've got a situation." She showed him the screen. It was filled with reservation requests, not just for dinner, but for what people were calling community nights. The hashtag #HarvestAndBuild had taken on a life of its own, with people across the country asking how they could implement similar programs in their own communities. But James was watching something else. Through the kitchen window, he could see Marcus Robinson shaking hands with a young white couple who had recognized him from his civil rights work. At another table, Mrs. Whitman was exchanging phone numbers with a black family, making plans to share more stories. And Jessica, still covered in flour, was listening to Sarah Harrison with the kind of attention that suggested she was learning about more than just bread. As the last dinner guests began to leave, Sarah Harrison sat at the bar, watching her grandson direct the cleanup with the same precision he brought to his cooking. The cookbook lay open beside her, its pages somehow looking fresher, as if the evening's events had breathed new life into its aged paper. Jessica approached, her apron still dusted with flour. "Mrs. Harrison, I've been thinking about what you said about bread, about starting again." She took a deep breath. "I'd like to learn, not just the recipes, but everything." Sarah smiled, patting the seat next to her. "Sit down, child. Let me tell you about the first time I had to start again." Marcus Robinson, who had stayed until closing, was gathering his things when James approached him. "Mr. Robinson, before you go, I have a proposal." He outlined his vision for regular community dinners, legal clinics combined with cooking classes, and a mentorship program for young people interested in the culinary arts. "We could use someone with your expertise to help make sure we do this right." Marcus looked around the restaurant, at Maya finalizing the new policies on her tablet, at Mrs. Whitman helping to distribute leftover food to the homeless shelter next door, at Jessica learning from Sarah Harrison. "Send me the details," he said. "I think this could be the start of something important." The local news crews had one final surprise for the evening. Their coverage had caught the attention of a national civil rights organization, which announced plans to study Harvest and Rye's transformation as a model for business-led social change. The corporate investors who had initially demanded damage control were now proudly promoting their association with the restaurant's new initiatives. As the staff gathered for a final meeting, James stood next to his grandmother, looking at the faces before him, tired but transformed. "Today," he said, "we were reminded that a restaurant is more than just walls and tables and food. It's a place where change can happen if we're brave enough to let it." Sarah Harrison closed her cookbook but kept her hand on its worn cover. "Change is like a good meal," she added. "It needs the right ingredients, the right timing, and people willing to stay at the table even when the conversations get difficult." In the days that followed, Harvest and Rye would become known for more than its innovative Southern cuisine. The recipe cards, each telling a story of resistance and resilience, became collector's items. The community dinners, where people from all walks of life shared food and conversations, had a waiting list months long. The scholarship program, structured with Marcus's help, began opening doors for a new generation of diverse culinary talent. Jessica stayed on, working closely with Sarah Harrison to learn not just recipes but history, dignity, and the power of acknowledging one's mistakes. Mrs. Whitman became a regular at the community dinners, bringing friends who needed their own assumptions challenged. 1 month later, Marcus brought his entire law firm to dine at Harvest and Rye. As he watched Sarah Harrison teach a group of young people how to make her reconciliation bread, He realized that sometimes justice could be served not just in courtrooms, but in kitchens and dining rooms, one meal at a time. The cookbook remained in the restaurant, displayed prominently near the host's station. Its pages filled with recipes and remembrances continued to tell stories of a past that shouldn't be forgotten and a future that could be different. And every evening, as new guests arrived at Harvest and Rye, they were greeted with words now inscribed above the door. At this table, all are welcome. At this table, we learn. At this table, we grow. At this table, we begin again. For in the end, the story of Harvest and Rye wasn't just about one incident of discrimination or one moment of transformation. It was about the ongoing work of change, messy, challenging, and as necessary as bread itself. It was about people willing to stay at the table, to keep the conversation going, to acknowledge that the best recipes for justice require both tradition and innovation, both remembrance and hope. And somewhere in the city, other restaurants began to take notice. Other communities began to gather, and other tables began to be set with new understanding, proof that sometimes the most powerful changes begin with a single meal shared between strangers who choose to become something more.